The gun was already in her hand when Andrew Fletcher walked through the door of his own ranch house, and for one terrible second neither of them breathed. Esther Monroe stood in the center of the main room with the Colt revolver leveled at the chest of a man she had never spoken to before this night, a man whose face was hard and wind-burned, and whose eyes went wide not with fear, but with something she could not immediately identify, something that looked disturbingly close to recognition, as though he had been expecting her all his life and simply had not known it until this precise moment. The lantern on the table threw orange light across the both of them, and the shadows jumped, and the silence between them was so dense it had weight. "You are on my property," he said, and his voice was very quiet, which was worse than shouting. "I know whose property it is," Esther said. "That is exactly why I am here." She had come to Dellwater Valley 4 days ago with nothing but a carpet bag, a revolver she barely knew how to use, and a name written on a folded piece of paper that she kept in the breast pocket of her dress, pressed against her heart like a wound. The name on the paper was not Andrew Fletcher's. It was the name of the man who had destroyed her family, taken everything her father built over 30 years, and left her mother to die in a boarding house in Abilene with no money and no medicine and nothing, but shame wrapped around her shoulders like a shroud. The name on that paper was Bernard Collier, and she had followed that name for 800 miles across 3 territories until someone in the town of Dellwater had told her, in a voice full of careful warning, that Bernard Collier was a man who did business with the most powerful cattleman in the valley, a man named Andrew Fletcher, and that if she wanted to find Bernard Collier, she would eventually find him at the Fletcher ranch. So she had let herself into the ranch house through an unlocked back window, which should have told her something about the kind of man Andrew Fletcher was, a man so certain of his standing in this valley that he did not bother to lock his windows, and she had waited in the dark for 2 hours until the door opened and he walked in, and then she had done the only thing that made sense to her anymore, which was raise the gun. "Tell me where Bernard Collier is," she said, "and I will leave your house exactly as I found it." Andrew Fletcher did not answer immediately. He took off his hat with one slow, deliberate movement, set it on the hook by the door, and then turned back to look at her with those unreadable dark eyes, and she had the disorienting sensation that he was assessing her the way he might assess a horse, not with cruelty but with genuine and careful attention. "Put the gun down first," he said. "No. You are holding it wrong," he said. "Your wrist is going to give out inside of 2 minutes, and then you are going to hurt yourself or me or both of us, and none of that needs to happen." Esther's jaw tightened. "Where is Bernard Collier?" "I do not know where Bernard Collier is tonight," Andrew said. "That is the truth. He comes and goes as he pleases, and I am not his keeper. But you know him." "I know of him. That is a different thing." He took one step closer and she tightened her grip on the revolver, and he stopped. "My name is Andrew Fletcher. This is my home. You have clearly come a very long way, and you are clearly very determined, and I would like to understand why, but I cannot have that conversation with a gun between us." She stared at him. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than she had expected, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was set like rock. He did not look like a man who had ever been afraid of anything. But he also did not look like what she had feared he would be, which was a partner in cruelty. He looked tired, and something in his eyes, beneath all that steadiness, looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. She lowered the gun, not because she trusted him. She lowered it because her wrist was in fact giving out, just as he had predicted, and she refused to let him see the full humiliation of dropping it. He exhaled. It was not quite relief, not quite exasperation. It was something in between. "Sit down," he said. "I will make coffee, and then you are going to tell me everything." The story of how Esther Monroe arrived at that moment began not 4 days earlier in Dellwater, but rather 14 months before that, in the spring of 1882, in the Kansas city of Abilene, where her father, Thomas Monroe, had operated a dry goods store for 3 decades, and had built a life modest and steady as a heartbeat. Thomas Monroe was not a wealthy man, but he was a respected one, known for fair prices and an honest ledger, and the kind of handshake that meant something in a town still finding its footing after the wild years of the cattle drives. Bernard Collyer had arrived in Abilene presenting himself as an investor, a man of Eastern money looking to stake a claim in Western commerce. He had been charming in the way that men who intend harm are always charming, smooth and attentive, and full of promises delivered with a warm smile. He had approached Thomas Monroe about a partnership, a chance to expand the store, to take on merchandise from new suppliers, to grow into something larger than a single storefront. Thomas, who was 54 years old and had spent his whole life being careful, had let himself be swayed by the prospect of leaving something substantial to his daughter, and he had signed the papers Collyer put in front of him. Within 6 months, the partnership had consumed everything. The loans Collyer had taken in Thomas Monroe's name were real loans, carrying real interest, binding real property, and when the money Collyer had promised to inject into the business never materialized, the lenders came not for Collyer, who had vanished like smoke, but for Thomas, who had signed everything. The store went first, then the house. Then Thomas Monroe's heart gave out under the weight of it, and he died in April of 1883 owing debts he had never intended to incur, leaving his wife Catherine in a state of financial ruin, so complete it looked like a deliberate demolition, which it was. Esther had been 24 years old when her father died. She had been working as a seamstress in the shop 2 streets over from the family store, and she had watched the whole collapse with a horror that curdled slowly into something harder and colder than grief. She had nursed her mother through the worst of it, found them a room in the boarding house on Chestnut Street, taken on every piece of sewing work she could get, and sat with Catherine Monroe through 3 seasons of declining health until her mother, who had given up on the world in a quiet and deliberate way, died of pneumonia in January of 1884, without ever seeing her daughter again in their own home. After Catherine's death, Esther had spent 6 weeks in a kind of suspended stillness that was not grief and was not peace. It was the blank space a person inhabits when there is nothing left to love and nothing left to lose. She sold everything they still owned, paid the last of the debts, and was left with $64, a revolver that had belonged to her father, and the name Bernard Collyer written in her own hand on a piece of paper. She did not plan to shoot him. She had told herself that from the beginning, and she believed it. What she planned was something she could not fully articulate, a confrontation, a reckoning, a demand that he look her in the face and acknowledge what he had done. She did not know what she expected to feel afterward. She simply knew she could not move forward without it, could not build a new life while carrying the weight of a justice that had never been delivered. She had traced him through a chain of names and rumors that stretched across Kansas and into Colorado, and then south into New Mexico territory. And every trail eventually led toward the same general region, a stretch of high desert grassland in the southeastern part of the territory that had recently been opened to cattle ranching, where a man with Collyer's particular skills, the ability to charm investors and manipulate financial arrangements, would find fertile ground among men newly flush with land and ambition. Dellwater was a small town, newer than it looked, sitting at the base of a long valley between 2 ridges of sandstone that turned red in the afternoon light. The valley itself was perhaps 20 miles long and 10 miles wide, well watered by a creek that ran year-round, and it had been claimed in large portions by several cattlemen over the previous 5 years. The largest claim belonged to Andrew Fletcher, whose name she had heard a dozen times before she arrived, and who, by the account of everyone in Dellwater, was the de facto authority in the valley, not because he was brutal about it but because he was fair, and because he had been there longest and had worked hardest. She had taken a room at the Dellwater Hotel, which was really a boarding house with pretensions, and spent 2 days asking careful questions in the town's single general store, the small post office, and the barber shop, which was where men talked most freely. What she learned about Bernard Collier in Dellwater was both more and less than she had hoped. He was there, or had been recently, operating some kind of land brokerage scheme that involved persuading smaller landowners in the valley to sell their claims to an unnamed Eastern syndicate. Several people had already sold. Others were resisting. Andrew Fletcher, she was told, was suspicious of Collier, but had not yet found grounds to act openly against him. The sheriff, a man named Potts who was new to the job and nervous about his authority, was waiting to see which way the wind blew. What she had not anticipated, when she decided to go directly to the Fletcher ranch and confront the one man in the valley who had both the standing and the probable information to help her find Collier, was that she would have to wait in the dark for 2 hours with a gun and her own terror for company, and that when Andrew Fletcher finally walked through his door, he would look at her as though she were a problem he had been waiting to solve. He made the coffee in silence, moving around his kitchen with the ease of a man who lived alone and had organized his space precisely to his own habits, everything in the same place every time, every motion economical. He set a cup in front of her on the table and sat across from her with his own cup, and he looked at her steadily and waited. She told him. She told him all of it, Thomas Monroe and the false partnership and the loans and the lost store and her mother dying in a boarding house. And as she spoke, she watched Andrew Fletcher's face, and she saw something move through it that was not pity. She was grateful it was not pity, but was instead a kind of slow and building anger that he kept very carefully contained, the way a man contains a fire he has decided to manage rather than let burn loose. When she finished, he sat quietly for a long moment. "Collier has been working the valley for 3 months, he said. He approached me in January with a proposition about selling a portion of my grazing rights to a company out of St. Louis that does not, as far as I have been able to determine, actually exist. I turned him down. He has since gone around me to the smaller operations, and 3 families have already sold. I believe the deeds they signed are fraudulent and that the money they received came from a source I cannot yet identify, designed to create a chain of liability that will eventually come back on them rather than on him." Esther stared at him. "You already know what he is doing." "I suspected. I did not have proof. And I did not have someone who had seen his full pattern before." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his expression that was both careful and direct, a combination she had not often seen in a man. "You have seen his full pattern. You lived through it. That makes you the most valuable witness to what he is doing in this valley." "I am not a witness," she said. "I came here for a reckoning." "I know," he said, "and I understand that. But there may be a way to give you the reckoning and also stop him from doing to the Garza family and the Hendersons and the Murphys what he did to your father." He paused. "If you are willing to stay long enough." She had planned to leave Dellwater as soon as she had located Collier. She had not planned to stay. She had not planned anything beyond the confrontation she had been building toward for 14 months. The idea of staying, of being in this valley with this man who spoke to her with such directness and such unexpected gravity, landed on her with a weight she had not been prepared for. "Where would I stay?" she asked, because it was the most practical question and she needed to be practical. "The hotel in town is sufficient," he said. "And you would be safer there than making any kind of approach to Collier on your own." He paused again, and she noticed that he paused often, not because he was uncertain but because he thought before he spoke, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. "I would also like to say that I am sorry about your parents. That kind of loss and the manner of it is not something a person carries lightly." She had not expected that. The plain directness of it caught her somewhere behind her sternum, and she looked down at her coffee cup for a moment to give herself a breath. "No," she said. "It is not." She stayed that first night in his house without intending to, not in the way the thought might imply, but because the conversation went on until well past midnight, and the town was 3 miles down the valley road, and neither of them had thought to address the logistics until it was too late. He gave her a small room that he said had been his sister's before she married and moved to Santa Fe, and he showed her where the water was, and gave her a blanket, and said good night with a formality that was somehow neither cold nor stiff, but simply respectful, the behavior of a man who understood the difference between a woman's company and a woman's person. She lay in the dark in the small room that smelled of cedar and old lavender, and listened to the sounds of the valley at night, the distant low of cattle, the wind coming down off the sandstone ridges, and she tried to locate within herself the feeling she had been carrying for 14 months, the cold and purposeful anger that had carried her 800 miles. It was still there. But something else had arrived alongside it, something quieter and more confusing, a sense that she had walked into a story already in progress, one that had a shape she had not written herself. In the morning she woke to the sound of someone already in the kitchen, and she lay still for a moment listening to it, the scrape of an iron pan on the stove, the pour of water, ordinary domestic sounds that she had not heard around her in so long that they felt almost foreign. She dressed quickly and came out, and Andrew Fletcher was making breakfast with the same unhurried competence with which he had made coffee the night before, and he looked up when she appeared and said, "There are eggs and cornbread. Sit down." She sat down. "I want to go back to town today," she said. "I will take you," he said, "but first I want to show you something." He set a plate in front of her and sat with his own. "There is a man named Rafael Garza who has a small operation at the south end of the valley. Collier has been working on him for 6 weeks. Garza came to me last week to ask my advice, and I told him to wait and not sign anything. But he is under pressure from his wife, who believes the money from the sale will let them move to Albuquerque where her family is. I am going to go see Garza today, and I would like you to come with me, because if you can tell him what you told me last night, it might be the thing that makes the difference for his family." Esther looked at him. "You are asking me to stay and help you." "I am asking you to consider it." He met her eyes. "You are the only person in this valley who has direct knowledge of what Collier actually does to the people who sign his papers." She ate in silence for a moment. The eggs were good and the cornbread was still warm, and she noticed without intending to that he had given her the larger portion. "What do you get out of this?" she asked. He looked faintly surprised, as though the question had not occurred to him in the way she meant it. "I get Collier stopped," he said, "and the people in this valley protected. And what happens to Collier when he is stopped?" "He goes to jail," Andrew said, "or he leaves the territory permanently. Either way he stops. He should answer for what he did to my father," Esther said, and there was an edge in her voice she made no effort to soften. "He should," Andrew agreed, with a simplicity that startled her. "And the way to make that most likely to happen is to build a case against him that is broad enough and solid enough that the law has to take it seriously. A single woman with a grievance and a revolver, no matter how justified, is not going to accomplish that. A documented pattern of fraud across multiple states and territories, supported by witnesses, is a different matter." She stared at him across the table. "You have thought about this," she said. "I have been thinking about it for 3 months," he said. "I was only missing the piece that you represent." There was something in the way he said it, not flattering, not manipulative, but simply honest and analytical, that moved something in her she had not expected to have moved. She was not a woman who was easily managed. She had spent 14 months being entirely self-reliant, and she had no intention of handing that over to anyone. But this did not feel like being managed. This felt like being recognized, which was a different thing entirely and more dangerous. "I will go with you to see Garza," she said, "and then I will decide." The Garza Ranch was a modest operation, a small adobe house with a linta barn, and a fenced pasture where 20 or 30 cattle grazed in the thin spring grass. Rafael Garza was a man of perhaps 45, compact and weather-beaten, with a careful, watchful quality to his dark eyes. His wife Alina met them at the door with the wariness of a woman who had learned to distrust strangers, and then, reading something in Esther's face that her husband was slower to read, stepped back and let them in. Esther told her story again at the Garza kitchen table, more briefly this time, stripped to the essential facts. Rafael Garza listened with his hands flat on the table and his jaw slowly tightening. Elena Garza listened with her eyes filling slowly and steadily, and when Esther finished, Elena reached across the table and gripped Esther's hand with both of hers, and said something in Spanish that Esther could not understand but did not need to. Raphael said quietly that he would not be signing anything for Bernard Collier, and that he was grateful. On the ride back to the Fletcher ranch, because it was already afternoon and going back to town seemed pointless, Andrew was quiet beside her on the wagon seat, and she was quiet too, and the valley lay around them in the late March light, enormous and serene and indifferent to all the human entanglements taking place within it. And Esther found herself thinking about the word nothing, which was what she had come to this valley looking for, the blankness of an ending, a terminus. A place where the forward motion of grief would simply stop. She had not found nothing, she had found this. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, to break the silence and because she genuinely wanted to know. 8 years, he said. "I came here in 1876 from Missouri, bought the first parcel with everything I had saved in 6 years of cattle driving, added to it 3 times since." "You drove cattle from Texas to Abilene," he said, and then glanced at her sideways. "You are from Abilene." "I am." She paused. "Did you ever come into my father's store, Monroe's Dry Goods?" He thought about it with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. "I may have," he said. "In 1875 or 1876. I stopped in Abilene twice during those years." She looked at the valley spreading before them in the afternoon light and thought about the strangeness of that, the possibility that he had walked through her father's door years before any of this had happened, before Collier and the ruin and the long road south, and that Thomas Monroe might have handed him a sack of flour or a paper of nails with no knowledge of what connections were being laid invisibly between his daughter's life and this man's. "What are you thinking?" Andrew asked. She looked at him directly. "That the world is smaller than I expected," she said. He nodded slowly and returned his eyes to the road, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was the shape of one, and she filed that away alongside all the other observations she had been making about him without intending to. She did not go back to the town hotel that night or the night after. She stayed in the small, cedar-scented room, and she told herself it was practical, that she was needed at the ranch as a base of operations for the case they were building against Collier, that the 3 miles to town were an inconvenience. These things were true. They were also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had not felt safe anywhere in 14 months, and this house and the man in it made her feel, unreasonably and without clear justification, safe. She distrusted the feeling. She examined it from every angle looking for the hidden motive that would explain it away. She found none. Andrew Fletcher was direct and consistent and treated her with a respect that was not performative but habitual, the way a man treats people who deserve it simply because they are people. He asked her opinion on the Collier situation and listened when she gave it. He did not treat her story as a female grievance requiring male management, but as information requiring male and female collaboration. He cooked in the morning and she cooked in the evening without any discussion of whose job it was, and the rhythm of it settled over the days like something very old and very natural. They went to see the Henderson family on the 3rd day. James Henderson was a big, raw-boned Scotsman who had come to New Mexico territory from Colorado with his wife Margaret and 3 sons, and who had been, according to Andrew, on the verge of signing Collier's papers the week before. Esther spoke to Margaret Henderson privately while Andrew talked to James in the barn, and when they left 2 hours later, both Henderson adults had agreed to have no further dealings with Collier and had asked what they could do to help. On the 4th day, Andrew rode into town to meet with Sheriff Potts and attempt to interest him in a formal investigation, and Esther stayed at the ranch to write up a detailed account of her father's experience with Collier, including dates and names and amounts as best she could remember them, organized clearly enough to be useful as legal documentation. She sat at the kitchen table with pen and paper and worked through the afternoon with a concentration that was both painful and clarifying. And when Andrew came back in the early evening and found her still writing, he sat down across from her and waited. And when she finally set down her pen and looked up, he said, "How much of it do you remember?" "All of it," she said. "I wish I did not." He looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that was neither pity nor analysis but something that held elements of both and was more than either, a kind of grave and attentive witnessing. "You carry it very well," he said. "I carry it constantly," she corrected. "Those are not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he agreed. "They are not." And then, surprising her, he said, "My wife died 4 years ago, fever. We had been married 2 years and she was 26. He said it simply, without the performance of grief, the way a fact is stated that has been lived with long enough to be spoken plainly. "I know something about carrying things constantly." She looked at him across the table. This was the first personal thing he had told her, not the information about the ranch or the cattle driving years, but something that cost him something to say. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it fully. "Thank you," he said, and the simplicity of his acceptance was, she thought, the most mature response she had ever heard a person give to condolence. That was the night the wall between them, which had been solid and practical and mutually maintained, developed the first visible crack. They talked after supper, not about Collier or the case or the Valley families, but about everything else, about Missouri and Kansas, and what those places had been 20 years ago before the railroads changed them, about books. He had 3 shelves of them, and she had left all of hers behind when she left Abilene, about what it was that made a place feel like a home rather than a location. She said she did not think she had felt at home anywhere since her parents were alive. He said he had felt at home in this valley almost from the first week, but that the house had stopped feeling like a home after his wife died and had become simply a place where he ate and slept, functional but not warm. "It feels warm now," she said, and then heard herself say it and looked at the fire in the hearth rather than at him. There was a silence that was different from the other silences they had shared, which had been comfortable or thoughtful or simply quiet. This one had an awareness in it. "Yes," he said, very carefully. "It does." She went to bed shortly after that, and she lay in the dark in the cedar-scented room and acknowledged to herself what was happening with an honesty she could not have afforded earlier in her life. She was falling in love with a man she had met by pointing a gun at him. This was, by any measure, a deeply impractical development. She had come to this valley with a single purpose, the coldest and most focused purpose she had ever held, and she had arrived to find that purpose embedded in a larger situation that included a man who made her feel, for the first time in more than a year, like a person who had a future rather than only a past. She did not know what to do with that. Andrew Fletcher, lying in his own room at the other end of the hall, was having a parallel experience. He had spent 4 years in a state he could only describe to himself as functional numbness, doing the work of the ranch, managing the valley's social and economic dynamics, being useful and reliable and present in all the ways that were expected of him, and feeling, beneath all of that, a hollowness that he had come to accept as permanent. He had not looked for anything to fill it. He had not known, precisely, what shape the thing would need to be to fill it. He had moved through his days with the competence of a man who knows his job and does it well, and he had told himself that was enough. And then a woman with dark eyes and a badly held revolver had materialized in the center of his main room and looked at him with the full force of her grief and her purpose, and something in him had recognized something in her, the way 2 people who have been carrying the same kind of weight will sometimes simply know it about each other on sight, and he had felt the hollowness shift. He could not name what he was looking for. He had not known he was looking. But he knew, lying in the dark on the 4th night of Esther Monroe's presence in his house, that something had begun that he did not want to end. The confrontation with Collier came sooner than either of them planned. It was a Thursday morning in early April, 11 days after Esther had let herself through the ranch house window, and she was in town at the post office sending the documentation she had written to a lawyer in Santa Fe, whose name Andrew had given her. A man named Harlow who had dealt with similar fraud cases, and who Andrew believed could pursue a legal claim against Collier that would extend back to Kansas. She had just handed the package to the postmistress when the door of the post office opened, and a man she recognized walked in. She would have recognized Bernard Collier anywhere. He was 50 years old, or close to it, with silver hair and a neat beard, and the ruddy, well-fed look of a man who has spent his entire life eating at other people's expense. He was wearing a good suit for a Thursday morning in a territorial town, the kind of suit designed to signal prosperity and trustworthiness, and he was talking to a younger man behind him about something with the easy, confident manner of someone who owned any room he walked into. He looked at Esther, and she saw the precise moment of non-recognition, the polite blank courtesy of a man who assumes all women are strangers and proceeds accordingly. And then she said, "Hello, Mr. Collier," and watched the recognition arrive like a hammer blow. He went pale. It was the paleness of a man confronted by something he had written off as safely impossible, a ghost, a consequence he had calculated away. He recovered quickly. She gave him that. The smoothness was reflexive, but his eyes in the moment before recovery told her everything she needed to know about his guilt. "I am afraid you have the advantage of me," he said, and his voice was almost steady. "Esther Monroe," she said, "Thomas Monroe's daughter, Abilene, Kansas, 1882. The younger man behind him registered none of this. Collier kept his eyes on Esther and said very quietly, "Miss Monroe, this is unexpected." "I do not imagine it was expected," she said, "but here I am." She was aware of the postmistress pretending not to listen. "And here you are, in a valley where you are apparently conducting the same business you conducted with my father. How many families have you taken in this territory, Mr. Collier?" "I conduct legitimate business," he said. The color was coming back into his face and he was reassembling the charm. She could see it happening, the way a mask is fitted back into place piece by piece. "Whatever grievance you believe you have, this is not the time or the place." "Then name the time and place," she said. "I have 800 miles of patience for it." He looked at her for a long moment and something passed behind his eyes that was not shame. She did not think he was capable of shame, but was rather calculation, the assessment of a dangerous situation. Then he smiled, the warm, practiced smile she had no doubt worked on everyone, and said, "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Monroe. Truly. But business is business, and the arrangements your father made were his own choices. I can only work with what men offer me." The rage she had been carrying for 14 months tried to crest, and she held it down by main force. "My father's choices were based on your lies," she said, "and the people in this valley are about to make choices based on the same lies, and I am going to make certain they do not." Something in Collier's face shifted and hardened, and for a moment he was not charming at all. Then the younger man said something to him about a meeting, and the moment passed, and Collier gave her one more look, assessing and cold, and then stepped around her and out the door. She stood in the post office with her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking and breath slowly and deliberately. The postmistress, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Alcott, said gently, "That man is trouble." "Yes," Esther said, "he is." She went straight back to the ranch. Andrew was in the yard when she rode in, working with one of his hands on a fence section, and he read her face before she had dismounted and came to meet her. She told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, the expression on his face was the fully visible version of the contained anger she had seen hints of before. "He knows you are here now," he said. "Yes." That changes the timing. He was already thinking forward, she could see it. He may try to accelerate his transactions with anyone who has not yet signed, or he may cut and run. Either way, we need to move faster than we planned." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" She had been asked that question before and found it maddening, the assumption of fragility. But the way he asked it was not an assumption of fragility. It was a genuine inquiry from a man who understood that standing in a room with the person who had ruined your family was not nothing, and that the honest answer might not be fine. "No," she said, "not entirely, but I am functional." "Functional is enough for now," he said, and the matter-of-factness of it was, absurdly, a comfort. They spent the afternoon riding to the 3 remaining Valley families that Collier had been targeting, warning them that the situation was coming to a head, and that they should sign nothing and approach Andrew immediately if Collier made contact. By evening, they had covered 2 of the 3 and were coming back along the Eastern Ridge Road when the sun was going low, and the valley below them turned the particular shade of amber and copper that Esther had stopped being indifferent to somewhere around the 5th day. "It is very beautiful here," she said, which surprised her because she had not intended to say it. Andrew looked out over the valley from beside her on the ridge road and was quiet for a moment. "It is," he said. "I forget to see it sometimes." "How do you forget to see this?" she asked. He looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "You are present in it in a different way when it is yours to manage," he said. "You see the fence line and the water level in the creek and the weight of the cattle and where the grass is coming in thin. The beauty is there, but it goes to the back of the mind. And I put it back to the front." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "you did." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the valley, because looking at the valley was significantly less complicated than looking at him. That was the night things shifted finally and completely out of the category of professionally collaborative and into territory that neither of them had a map for. They were in the main room after supper, Esther reading from one of his books and Andrew going through some papers, and she said without looking up, "What was her name?" "Your wife, Clara," he said. "Were you happy?" He set down his papers. "We were," he said, "for the time we had. She was a good woman and I was a better man with her than I am generally capable of being." He paused. "I did not think I would have that again." Esther looked up from the book. He was looking at the fire. His profile was all shadow and warm light, and the exhaustion she had noted on the first night, the exhaustion of years, was visible in the set of his shoulders. "Andrew," she said, and she did not know she was going to say it until she did. "What is it that you have been looking for in these 4 years?" He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the most open she had seen it, open and uncertain and entirely unguarded. "I do not know," he said. "I have not been able to name it." She held his gaze and felt something in her chest that was warm and frightening and enormous, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she understood now what she had stumbled into when she let herself through a rancher's back window in the middle of the night. She had come to this valley looking for nothing, for an ending, and she had found a man who was looking for something he could not name, and the terrible, extraordinary, entirely impractical truth was that they might be looking for each other. "I think," she said carefully, "that I came here for the wrong reason and may be staying for the right one." He was very still. "What is the right reason?" he asked, and his voice was lower and quieter than usual. "I do not know yet either," she said honestly, "but I should like to stay long enough to find out." The long look that passed between them then had the weight of everything unsaid and the warmth of everything beginning. He did not cross the room, and she did not move from her chair, and nothing happened precisely, except that something changed permanently in the air between them, a door that had been closed swinging open on very quiet hinges. "Then stay," he said. The following morning she sent a letter to the lawyer Harlow in Santa Fe with the full Abilene account, and he responded within the week with a confirmation that the details matched 2 other complaints against a man, using the name Collier and variants of it in Colorado and Texas, and that he believed a case could be made across jurisdictions that would compel territorial authorities to act. The wheels of legal mechanism, always slow in the territories, had begun to turn. Collier made his move, 10 days after the confrontation in the post office. He appeared at the Garza Ranch early on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by two men Esther had not seen before, and attempted to persuade Rafael Garza to sign the papers then and there, on the spot, without delay, the urgency of it a transparent symptom of a man who knew time was running out. Rafael, who had rehearsed this moment, told Collier calmly that he was not interested and asked him to leave his property. Collier pushed. The two men with him became physically present in an uncomfortable way, moving into the space between Collier and the Garza family with the body language of threat rather than persuasion. Rafael Garza sent his eldest son on horseback to the Fletcher ranch, and Andrew arrived at the Garza place within 40 minutes, and Esther came with him. What Andrew said to Collier on the Garza doorstep was spoken so quietly that Esther, standing 6 feet away, could only hear parts of it. What she could hear was precise and controlled, and contained a specific reference to the lawyer Harlow in Santa Fe, and the complaints registered in 3 territories. And the phrase, delivered with the absolute flatness of a man who means everything he says, that if Collier or his associates made any further attempt to contact any family in Dellwater Valley, Andrew would make it his personal business to ensure that the sheriff, the territorial governor's office, and the Associated Press were all thoroughly informed of everything the lawyer Harlow had collected. Collier's face went through several colors during this recitation. The two men with him looked at each other with the body language of people recalibrating whether they were being paid enough for this. Collier left. He did not leave the territory immediately. He was not that simple, but he left the Garza ranch and did not return, and Andrew rode to town to see Sheriff Potts with the full documentation Harlow had sent and with Esther beside him, and Potts, no longer uncertain about which way the wind was blowing, sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. The territorial marshal arrived 2 weeks later. His name was Calloway, and he was a laconic man from Texas who read everything Esther had prepared and every document Harlow had forwarded, and then asked Esther 3 hours of precise questions in the hotel parlor while Andrew sat nearby and said nothing. And at the end of it, Calloway told her that this was sufficient to arrest Bernard Collier on charges of fraud across multiple jurisdictions, and that he would be doing so within the next 48 hours. He was arrested on a Wednesday afternoon in April in the lobby of the Dellwater Hotel. Esther was not present for the arrest, a choice she made deliberately. She had built the case that made the arrest possible. She did not need to watch the handcuffs go on. She was at the Fletcher ranch when Andrew came back and told her, and she sat with it for a long moment in the same chair where she had sat on the first night and drunk his coffee and told him her story. "It is done," she said. "The trial will take time," Andrew said, "but yes, the most important part is done." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I thought I would feel more," she said. "I thought there would be some great release, an unburdening." "Does it not feel like that?" She considered it. "It feels like the end of a chapter," she said. "Not the end of the story." She looked up. "My parents are still gone." "Collier going to jail does not change that." "No," Andrew said. "It does not." He sat down across from her, the same positions as the first night, the same table, the same lantern. "But you did something that very few people manage to do. You followed a wrong done to your family for a year and a half across 800 miles, and you found the person responsible, and you built the case that will hold him accountable. That is not nothing." She looked at him, this man who had looked at her steadily from the first night without flinching, without condescension, without managing her, and she felt the warm, frightening, enormous thing in her chest spread outward to her hands and her throat. "No," she said softly, "it is not nothing." She paused. "Neither is this." The word "this" was very small and carried a great deal. He looked at her across the table and the lamp between them and said, "Esther," just her name, just that, in a voice that was low and careful and full of everything he had not yet said. "I know," she said. "I know." He crossed the room. He was deliberate even about this. The same unhurried competence he brought to everything, and he came and crouched down beside her chair so that he was at eye level with her rather than standing over her. And he looked at her for a moment before he took her right hand that had pointed the revolver at him on the first night, and held it in both of his with a gentleness that seemed to her almost startling in a man of his size and solidity. "I have not been certain," he said, "that I had the right to say anything to you. You came here in grief and in purpose. I did not want to be another man who took advantage of a woman's difficult circumstances." "You have not taken advantage," she said. "You have been from the first night the exact thing I needed without knowing I needed it." "What thing is that?" "Someone who treated me like I was capable," she said. "Someone who listened. Someone who saw the situation clearly and helped me see it clearly too." She turned her hand over in his and held it. "Someone who makes very good coffee at midnight." The corner of his mouth moved, the almost smile she had been watching for weeks. "I have better qualities than my coffee," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been cataloging them." He looked at her with that unguarded expression she had seen for the first time on the night she asked about what he was looking for, and he said, quietly, and with the simplicity that was entirely characteristic of him, "I think I have been looking for someone who looked back." She understood that precisely. She understood the particular loneliness of a person who has been surrounded by people and still felt unseen. And she knew, in a way that went below thought to something more fundamental, that this man saw her. Not the grief, not the purpose, not the woman with the gun or the woman with the story, but the actual person underneath all of that, Esther Monroe, who liked books and could not abide dishonesty, and had come to a valley in the desert looking for nothing, and found something she could not have named a month ago either. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a tentative gesture. She had spent 14 months being uncertain about very little, and she was not uncertain about this. He kissed her back with the same steadiness and attention he brought to everything, and there was nothing hurried or reckless about it. It was a first kiss that knew itself to be a beginning and conducted itself accordingly. And when they separated, she was still holding his hand, and he had his other hand against her jaw, and they looked at each other in the lamplight, and the warmth between them was as real and solid as the walls of the room. "I think," Andrew said with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words, "that you should stay in the valley." "You think that, do you?" she said. "I do." A pause. "I recognize this is a significant thing to say to a woman who came here with no intention of staying." "I came here with no intention of anything beyond a confrontation," she said. "All my intentions have changed substantially." She looked at him. "I have nowhere to go back to, Andrew. Abilene is gone. My family is gone. I spent 14 months with nothing ahead of me but this purpose, and now the purpose is accomplished and I have been sitting in this chair trying to figure out what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" he asked. She looked around the room, at the 3 shelves of books and the good solid table and the fire and the hearth, and then back at him, at his face that she had spent a month reading like a text she was still learning the language of. "This," she said. "I want this to come next." The spring became summer in Dellwater Valley, with the slow and gorgeous progression that the desert does when it is well watered, the creek running high from snowmelt in the mountains to the north, the grass thick and green in the lower meadows, the sandstone ridges shifting through every shade of red and orange and gold in the changing light of different times of day. Esther found that she had been wrong in her first weeks to assume she would find it indifferent. The valley was not indifferent. It had a character, wide and airy and ancient, and it came to feel, over the weeks of that spring and into the long, warm days of summer, not like a place she had been stranded but like a place she had arrived at. She moved officially from the small cedar room into Andrew's room in May, and this was conducted with no dramatic announcement, but simply with the natural gravitation of 2 people who had been orbiting each other for weeks, and had decided that orbiting was no longer the appropriate arrangement. His sister Maria came up from Santa Fe to visit in June, a warm and direct woman of 30 who had her brother's steadiness and a great deal more humor, and she took one look at Esther, and then looked at Andrew with an expression that said she had been waiting for precisely this and was gratified. "He is a good man," Maria said to Esther privately, in the straightforward way of a woman speaking to another woman. "He has been very alone." "I know," Esther said. "He was not good at being alone," Maria said. "He was functional at it, but people like my brother are not meant for it." She paused. "Neither, I think, are people like you." Esther thought about that for a long time. She had told herself for 14 months that she did not need anyone, that the grief and the purpose were sufficient company, that the mission was enough. She had not realized how exhausted she was by all that solitude until she was no longer in it. The trial of Bernard Collyer took place in Santa Fe in the autumn of 1884. Esther traveled to Santa Fe to testify, and Andrew came with her, and she stood in the territorial courtroom and told her story for the third and final time with a clarity and composure that surprised even herself, the composure of a woman who has been seen and steadied by someone who loves her, who no longer has to carry the thing alone. Collyer, who had been attempting his charming defense for 3 weeks, looked at her from the defendant's table with the calculating eyes of a man realizing he had fundamentally miscalculated the consequences of his actions, and the jury convicted him on 7 counts of fraud across 3 territories. The sentence was 10 years in the territorial prison. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But when she walked out of the courthouse and into the October light of Santa Fe, Andrew was beside her, and she looked at the sky and thought of her father and her mother and felt, for the first time in 20 months, that she had done everything she could do and that it was time to put the rest down. She cried that night in the hotel room, the first time she had properly cried since her mother died, and Andrew held her and said nothing except her name, occasionally, softly, in a voice that told her she was not alone and that everything did not have to be all right now and that he was not going anywhere. She cried for her father and her mother, and the years of her family's life that Collyer had taken, and the years of her own life spent in grief and pursuit. She cried until she was empty, and then she slept for 11 hours. In the morning she felt scraped clean and very light, the way a person feels after a fever breaks, raw but free of something that had been burning too long. They were married in December of 1884 at the Dellwater Church, which was small and adobe and smelled of pine resin and candle wax. Maria came from Santa Fe with her husband and their 2 children. The Garza family came, Raphael in his best shirt and Alina in a red dress with her hair pinned up. The Henderson family came, all 5 of them, James Henderson carrying a jar of preserved peaches as a wedding gift, with the sheepish air of a man who has never known what to give at a wedding. Sheriff Potts came. Mrs. Alcott, the postmistress, came and cried cheerfully. Half the valley came, because Andrew Fletcher had been a reliable and steady presence in their community for 8 years, and people wanted to celebrate a good man finding something good. Esther wore a dress she had made herself from dark blue wool with a cream collar, because she was a seamstress, and she made beautiful things, and she saw no reason to ask someone else to make what she could make better herself. Andrew wore his best suit, which was not particularly fine but was very clean, and when she came down the aisle of the small church on the arm of Raphael Garza, who had offered because Esther had no family left and he said she was family now, Andrew watched her come toward him with an expression so open and unguarded that Maria, sitting in the front pew, pressed her knuckle to her mouth and blinked very fast. The ceremony was simple. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken in plain, clear voices, and when the minister said Andrew could kiss his bride, Andrew cupped her face in both his big hands and kissed her with the same care and attention he had brought to the first kiss in October, as though she were the most important thing in the room, which to him she was. The winter of their first year together was the warmest Esther had spent in a long time, not because of the weather, which was cold and occasionally fierce, the valley getting real winter up in its high desert elevation, but because of the quality of the days. They were full days, not busy with frantic distraction but genuinely full, stocked with the small and large satisfactions of shared work and shared evenings, and the steady accretion of a life built in common. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, not just the domestic rhythms but the whole pattern of it, when to move the cattle, where the water was most reliable, what the grass told you about the quality of the past season. Andrew taught her with the same patient directness he brought to everything, and she taught him in return the things she knew: how to keep a proper account book, how to evaluate the fairness of a contract, how to write a letter that a lawyer would take seriously, and he accepted her knowledge with the same ungrudging attention with which she accepted his. In the spring of 1885 she discovered she was pregnant. She told Andrew on a Sunday evening in April, and the expression that moved across his face was one she had not seen before, not the steadiness or the contained warmth but something altogether less contained, a brightness that was almost boyish, and that undid her completely. He held her for a very long time and she could feel him breathing against her hair, and she knew he was thinking about Clara, the wife who had died before they had children, and she was not troubled by that. The heart is not a simple vessel, it carries more than one thing at a time. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Terribly," he said, with the honesty she had loved in him from the beginning. "Good," she said. "I would not trust a man who was not." Their son was born in November of 1885, and they named him Thomas Andrew Fletcher, Thomas for her father and Andrew for his, and he was a loud and vigorous child from the first hour, which the midwife, a Navajo woman named Pearl who had delivered half the babies in the valley, said was an excellent sign. He had Andrew's dark eyes and Esther's determined expression, and Andrew held him in the delivery room with the careful, terrified reverence of a man holding something irreplaceable. And Esther, exhausted and relieved and more overwhelmed with feeling than she had ever been in her life, watched her husband hold their son, and thought that she had come to this valley looking for nothing, for an ending, for the blank terminus of a purpose fulfilled, and she had found instead the absolute opposite. A beginning of such magnitude and warmth that it still astonished her. Thomas was a good baby in the way that some babies simply are, unhurried and curious and easily contented, and the ranch house, which had been Andrew's practical space and then Esther's warm space, and then their shared space, became something new with a child in it, noisier and softer at the same time. Maria came up from Santa Fe when Thomas was 3 weeks old and stayed for 2 weeks, and taught Esther several things about babies that Esther absorbed with the focused attention she brought to learning anything new. And Maria said privately to Andrew that his wife was the most capable woman she had ever met, and that he had better know how fortunate he was. "I know," Andrew said, with the simplicity she had always loved in him. "Good," Maria said. The valley continued its own life around them, the smaller ranches stabilizing after the Collier disruption, new families arriving each year, Dellwater growing slowly into something more than it had been, a second general store opening in 1886, a school established the same year in a new building at the edge of town. Esther, who had spent 3 years making herself useful in every direction the situation had required, found a new direction in the school, not as a teacher, but as one of the founding members of the school board, applying to that endeavor the same organizational clarity she had applied to the Collier case and the ranch accounts, and the school was well administered and well supplied from its first year. Andrew and several of the other valley cattlemen, including Raphael Garza and now a recovered and grateful James Henderson, began working in 1887 toward a formal water rights arrangement that would protect all the valley operations through drought years, a collaborative effort that required the kind of sustained civic engagement Andrew was well suited to, patient and fair and consistent. The arrangement they eventually reached and had legally registered was known informally around the territory as the Dellwater Compact, and it became a model that several other valley communities would attempt to replicate. Esther wrote to the lawyer Harlow in Santa Fe periodically, not about legal business, but simply to maintain the connection with the man who had helped bring Collier to justice. Harlow wrote back with the faithful regularity of a person who appreciated being remembered. In one of his letters in 1887, he mentioned that Collier had attempted to run a scheme from inside the territorial prison, persuading other inmates to invest in a fictional mining operation, which had been discovered immediately, and had resulted in additional charges that extended his sentence to 15 years. Esther read this to Andrew at the supper table, and they were both quiet for a moment, and then Andrew said, "A man who cannot stop is a man who does not know who he is without the harm," and Esther thought that was one of the truest things she had ever heard. In 1888, she discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the process was more familiar and less frightening. And Thomas, who was 2.5 and full of opinions about everything, received the news of a sibling with complete indifference until his sister arrived in February of 1889, at which point he revised his position substantially downward and conducted himself for the first 3 months with the aggrieved dignity of a person who has been betrayed by fate. They named her Clara for Andrew's first wife, because Esther had suggested it and Andrew had been unable to speak for a full minute when she did. "She would have been a good aunt," Esther said. "She would have," Andrew agreed when he could. Clara was entirely different from Thomas, vocal from the first hour where Thomas had been placid, demanding where he had been easily contented, and she looked precisely like her mother, dark eyes, and a determined expression that the family would tease Esther about for years. She and Thomas eventually reached an accommodation, which was achieved entirely on Clara's terms, and they became the kind of siblings who are devoted to each other in between vigorous disagreements, which Esther and Andrew agreed was probably optimal. The spring of 1889 brought a long letter from Esther's cousin Ada, who was the only family she had left on either side, a daughter of her mother's sister who lived in Colorado Springs and had not been in regular contact since the Abilene disaster but had, apparently, been thinking of Esther often, and had heard through some chain of connection that Esther had married and was settled in New Mexico territory. Ada's letter was cautious and somewhat formal, the letter of a person who is uncertain whether contact will be welcome, and Esther read it twice and then wrote back immediately with warmth and the full account of everything that had happened in the 5 years since they had last spoken, and the correspondence that began between them became, over the following years, one of the steadiest and most nourishing things in Esther's life, a thread back to her family's history that she had not expected to recover. Ada visited in the summer of 1890, making the journey from Colorado Springs by train to Albuquerque and then by stage to Dellwater, and she arrived windblown and laughing and declared the valley to be the most beautiful place she had ever seen, and Thomas Fletcher, who was 4, to be the most charming child, and Clara Fletcher, who was 1 and already walking, to be a force of nature. She stayed 3 weeks, and she and Esther spent long evenings in the main room talking about their mothers, who had been sisters, and their childhoods, and the Texas and Kansas towns of their respective origins, and what it meant to be a woman who had made something out of wreckage. Andrew, who read the evenings carefully, made himself scarce during these conversations with the fine instinct of a man who understood that some things needed to be held between women. He was not excluded. He simply knew to step back, which was, Esther thought, one of the many things about him that she found quietly extraordinary. The ranch itself had grown steadily through the second half of the decade, not dramatically but soundly. A 3rd parcel added in 1887, the herd expanded, a bunkhouse built for the 3 permanent hands Andrew now employed. One of the hands, a young Mexican man named Tomás who was 23 and had come to the valley from Sonora seeking work, had been with the ranch for 2 years and had become, in the way of capable people who are given real responsibility, genuinely indispensable. Andrew paid him well and treated him with the same straightforward respect he offered everyone, which in the labor arrangements of 1880's New Mexico Territory was not universal, and was something Tomás acknowledged by never missing a day's work and learning the operation of the ranch with remarkable speed. On a September evening in 1890, 5 years after their marriage, Andrew and Esther sat on the bench outside the ranch house in the long, cool air of an early autumn evening, the valley below them settling into dusk, Thomas and Clara in bed, the cattle settled for the night, the world quiet. Andrew had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the companionable silence they had developed over 5 years, the silence of two people who have said so much to each other that silence itself has become a form of conversation. "Do you ever miss it?" Andrew asked. "The life before, whatever it would have been." She considered it honestly. "I miss my parents," she said. "I will always miss them, but the life before, no, the life before was not yet a life. It was a preparation for something I had not found yet. And you found it here." "I found it with you," she said. "The valley is part of it, but you are the center of it." He tightened his arm around her and she felt the old, familiar solidity of him, the steadiness that had been the first thing she had recognized about him on the first night, and that had proved over 5 years to be not a performance but a fundamental characteristic, the bedrock of who he was. "I spent a long time," he said, "looking for something I could not name, after Clara died. I went through every day doing the work and being present in the ways that were required and feeling underneath all of it that there was something missing that I would not be able to find because I could not describe what it was. And now I know what it was," he said. "It was you, specifically and exactly you." He paused. "I could not name it because I had not met you yet." She looked up at him in the fading light, and his face was the face she knew best in the world now, better than any other. And she thought that love, real love, the kind that builds rather than consumes, was not the feeling she had read about in the books she had grown up with, the dramatic and consuming passion, the thunderstruck certainty of first sight. It was this. A man who made coffee at midnight and held you when you cried and crouched down to your level to take your hand and stepped back when something needed to be between women and taught you the water levels and the grass quality, and asked what you wanted next without assuming he already knew. It was knowing someone, being known. The mutual and sustained and always deepening project of two people who had decided to see each other clearly for as long as they both lived. "You found it," she said softly, "and I found it, and neither of us expected it." "No," he agreed, "neither of us expected it." They sat in the growing dark, and the stars came out over the valley, thousands of them in the high desert sky, the great unobstructed canopy of a sky far from any city, and the creek could be heard distantly from the lower meadow, and somewhere on the east ridge a coyote called and was answered, and the valley held them, wide and old and entirely indifferent in the best possible sense, a place that went on regardless of human pain or human joy, that had been here before them and would be here after, and into which they had woven, over 5 years of work and love and grief made bearable, a life that was genuinely and wholly theirs. In 1892, Esther went back to Abilene for the first time since she had left it, not out of unfinished business, but because Ada had suggested that she should see it from the other side, from the perspective of a woman who had found her footing and could look at the place of her loss without being consumed by it. She went alone, because Andrew understood without her explaining it that this was something she needed to do by herself, and she spent 4 days in Abilene walking the streets of her childhood, standing in front of the building where Monroe's dry goods had been, which was now a hardware store, and visiting the cemetery where her parents were buried in graves she had not been able to maintain. She brought flowers and she cleaned the stones, and she sat beside her father's grave and told him, in the quiet manner of a woman who is no longer embarrassed to speak to the dead, everything that had happened. "Thomas Monroe," she said, "you would have liked him. He is the most honest man I have ever known, which you would have recognized immediately. and he is good to me in the way that is real rather than decorative. And we have 2 children, Thomas Andrew, who has your stubbornness, and Clara, who has my mother's laugh, and the ranch is doing well. And the man who took everything from you is in a territorial prison, and I was the one who helped put him there." She sat with her hand on the warm stone for a while and felt the grief, which did not go away and never would, settle into its proper place, not smaller but properly contained, a part of her story that was hers to carry, and that she carried now alongside enough love to make the carrying possible. She came home to Dellwater on a Friday afternoon in October, and Andrew met the stage in town, which he had not told her he would do. And she stepped down from the stage into the warm autumn light, and he was there with Thomas on his hip, Thomas being 6 now and technically too old to be carried, but entirely willing to suspend that dignity for the occasion, and Clara standing beside her father in a red coat, holding his free hand with a solemnity that was entirely her own. And Esther looked at them on the main street of Dellwater under the October sky, and felt something complete itself inside her, in a way that she had not known was still waiting to complete. She crossed the space between them and kissed Andrew, which Thomas found deeply objectionable and Clara found philosophically interesting, and then she gathered her daughter into her arms, and let Thomas slide down from his father to stand beside her, and she stood there in the middle of Dellwater's main street with her family around her, and the valley spread behind them all, and she thought, clearly and without the need to examine or qualify it, that this was everything. They went home. Thomas talked about the ranch dog the entire 3-mile drive, and Clara fell asleep against Esther's side, and Andrew drove the wagon with one hand and held Esther's hand with the other. And the late afternoon light lay across the valley in long golden bars, and the sandstone ridges glowed their most extravagant red, and the creek ran bright and clear in the lower meadow, and the cattle were strung out in the long grass along the western slope. And the ranch house sat at the base of the eastern ridge with its windows already lit against the coming evening, warm and solid and permanent. Esther Monroe had come to Dellwater Valley looking for nothing. She had arrived at the absolute end of herself, carrying grief and purpose and a badly held revolver and a name on a piece of paper, and she had walked into the life of a man who had been looking, for 4 years and without knowing it, for exactly the thing she was. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, across the barrel of a gun and the full weight of loss, and what they had built together in the years since was not merely a life, but a testament to the possibility of beginning again after an ending, of warmth after long cold, of the extraordinary and ordinary daily miracle of 2 people who have chosen each other completely and keep making that choice with every passing year. Thomas Andrew Fletcher grew up to work the ranch beside his father with the same unhurried competence, and would add 2 more parcels to the operation before he was 30. Clara Fletcher grew up with her mother's love of books and her father's moral directness, and became, in time, a school teacher in the valley where she was born, which was exactly the right thing for her to be. Ada in Colorado Springs remained a steady and beloved presence through letters and visits, the family connection restored and cherished. Bernard Collier served 12 of his 15 years before his health failed, and he was released to a room above a barber shop in Santa Fe, aged and diminished, and entirely without the charm that had been his only real asset. Esther knew this because Harlow wrote to tell her, not out of cruelty but because he thought she deserved to know, and she read the letter and set it down and said to Andrew, "It is over," and he said, "Yes," and that was all there was to say about it. The valley grew around them, and the years moved through their seasons, and Andrew Fletcher, who had been looking for something he could not name, found himself, in his 50s, a man so full of purpose and love, and the daily richness of a life shared with the right person that the hollowness of his middle years seemed like something that had happened to someone else, a cautionary tale about a man who had been functional without being alive, and who had been delivered from that half-existence, by a woman who walked in out of the dark and changed everything. And Esther Monroe, who had come to the valley looking for nothing, had found more than she could have imagined or asked for or planned: a home and a partner and children, and the long, slow, deep satisfaction of a life that was genuinely her own, built from the wreckage of loss by her own hands, and sustained by the love of a man who had seen her from the first moment and never stopped seeing her. The valley held them in its wide and ancient embrace, and the creek ran on, and the sandstone glowed red in the changing light, and every morning the sun rose over the eastern ridge and fell across the ranch house windows, and the world continued, ordinary and extraordinary at once, precisely as it always had and always would.